From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, theZoomer, hosted by Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to theZoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Today, we're talking money. Canada's key interest rate is at a 22-year high, sitting at 5%. And the latest inflation numbers show a jump to 4%, up from 3.3% just the month before. This has sparked talks about the possibility of raising interest rates again before the end of the year. In the meantime, individuals from all walks of life are feeling the financial pinch as the escalating cost of borrowing puts pressure on their everyday budgets. It's a situation that hits close to home for Zoomers, who weathered inflation in the 1970s and double-digit interest rates in the early 80s, both triggered by surges in food and energy prices. So we've assembled an expert panel to ask, is a recession coming, and what are the best ways to protect your budget and keep a close eye on your spending? It's good to have you all here at the round table and some remote. Avi, I'll begin with you. Is a recession coming? What is your gut feeling on that at this point in time?
Well, my gut feeling is that's not a very interesting question, because a recession is technically defined as 2 consecutive quarters of decrease in real GDP. And everybody's predicting either we're going to be close to it being flat, maybe GDP will go down a little bit, maybe it will go up a little bit. But in any of those scenarios, I don't think it's going to make that much difference for ordinary Canadians.
So what is coming then? Are we looking at mortgage defaults? Are we looking at a dramatic decline in consumer spending? What's your sense?
Well, those are the more important problems. The effect of high interest rates is very, very scary for most people, and inflation and prices, like those are the real challenges. What's going to happen? I can't say.
Okay, well, let's put it to some of the other panelists. Jim, recession or soft landing?
I agree with Avi's judgment that the question of whether it's a recession or not per se doesn't really matter, because we're already into a period of effectively zero growth. In the last 3 quarters in Canada, 2 of them have been negative slightly, and 1 of them has been positive slightly. Now, if the next quarter is negative slightly, which seems likely to me, then we're in an official recession. But in a way, that doesn't tell us anything new. We're in a situation where there's zero growth, there's rising unemployment, and there's obviously huge pinches on household spending power because of the high interest rates and the rising unemployment.
So what is to come then, Jim?
We know what we're dealing with. Now, it could get worse. That scenario of zero growth for, a year or a year and a half or 2 years is the Bank of Canada's preferred soft landing scenario, they call it. A worse scenario would be what I'd call a real recession, where you're seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, foreclosures by households, and a sustained decline in output and employment. That is still a risk, and unfortunately, it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Sylvain, recent food inflation numbers offer a glimmer of hope. The lowest since February 2022, is it?
That's right. But people are spending less at the grocery store. If you look at the last 2 quarters, according to Statistics Canada, sales have actually dropped, and people aren't necessarily going to the restaurant all that much more. So really, the food industry is feeling it. Why? Probably because people are spending more money to make sure that they keep a roof over their heads. A lot of money is being spent on rents, on mortgages right now, and if you can trade down on something, it's not going to be for your own roof, it's going to be at the grocery store.
Brett, I want to know your perspective on this, and also I would ask, how did we get here to the point where last year inflation peaked at 8%, the highest in 40 years?
It's a great question, and I think I agree with Jim and Avi absolutely that it doesn't really matter the technical definition of if we're in a recession or not, but more so that Canadians are feeling like we're in a recession. And that's probably the most important point that has to be discussed here. Now, in terms of how we got here, I think what's happening is the Canadian economy is at a bit of an inflection point. There's a number of different headwinds when you look at the macroeconomic statistics that drive our economy. Productivity is lower, significantly lower than the U.S. The complexity of the Canadian economy is not anywhere near what other countries similar to Canada have. And so there's a number of challenges and headwinds that we're having to face. And if you look at the inflation in particular, it's a combination of obviously supply chain challenges, which many do think is transitory. It was spending throughout the pandemic, which had to happen to support Canadians. So there are a number of factors that are leading into it. Now it's a question of how do we address these, and it's not going to be a simple fix. It's going to be a complicated solution.
Jim, I'm getting the sense from people, just anecdotally and in some of the things that I've read, that people are starting to lose faith in the Bank of Canada. And so my question to you is, do you think that the bank has sort of misdiagnosed this problem? You often hear them talk about how they think unemployment is too low, wages are too high. And I think the general sentiment among Canadians is, well, wait a minute, it's not that I have too high of wages, but it's that prices have shot ahead of what I can afford.
I often think of that when you hear Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, say the problem is an overheated labor market. Too many Canadians are working and they're making too much money. I want to see him go down to the parking lot at Loblaws, and when shell-shocked customers come out having paid $200 for a cart of groceries, have him tell them, you know why the food prices are so high? Too many of you are working and you're making too much money. He'd be chased out of the parking lot. And it is a misdiagnosis of the unique circumstances that created this burst of inflation after the pandemic. We had shutdowns. We had shortages of key commodities, from semiconductors to vehicles to building products. We had transportation problems all around the world. And then on top of it all, we had an energy price shock from the invasion of Ukraine, amplified by the speculative behavior of global oil futures markets. None of that has anything to do with how much Canadians are making and how many of them are working. So in that regard, we have been punishing the victims of inflation, and I think it's quite understandable that Canadians are wondering. The Bank of Canada kind of pulled out this 40-year-old playbook for how they handled the so-called wage price spiral back in the 70s and the 80s. This is a very different inflation, and I think we needed a very different response to it.
Actually, in just a moment, we'll dive into the Bank of Canada's journey toward its 2% inflation target and just how challenging that road may be for ordinary Canadians. Next.